For the last year, our investigative team has been tracking hate-inspired violence and the growth of domestic terrorism and its connections to the modern-day white supremacy, white power movement. Here's a sneak peek of our series, Homegrown Hate.
You'll see the white power movement on the march.
You will not replace us!
Like a monster that went into hibernation, and this was evidence that the monster has come out.
The displays of racism and violence that we're seeing in the U.S. are certainly not new.
It's a cancer in the fabric of this country.
Part of this long legacy of people organizing over time. Within the white power movement, the Oklahoma City bombing stands as the culmination of decades of organizing.
Timothy McVeigh has been found guilty on all 11 counts.
He was trying to call people to arms and to provoke a race war.
Kids are fair game, women are fair game.
It's meant to be a battle strike. It's meant to incite war.
You wonder if the clues that were there had been unearthed, or whether things might be different.
We were not sufficiently prepared.
An act of domestic terrorism carried out by a movement that we have not classified, confronted, or understood.
Save the white race!
All we're doing is planting the seeds for future Timothy McVeighs to do the kinds of things we saw in Oklahoma City.
There are going to be more victims.
We have a problem in the country. It's getting worse.
Are you willing tonight to condemn white supremacists and militia groups?
We just need to start talking about race. There's no shortcut around that.
And joining us now to set the record straight is one of the voices that you just heard from there. Former FBI agent Michael German infiltrated white nationalist groups and spent years undercover. He's now a fellow with the Brennan Center for Justice's Liberty and National Security Program. Michael, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
So you know all too well the threat that far-right extremists pose, something that the president last night again refused to denounce or even accept as a reality. He quickly made a comparison to Antifa, Biden arguing that it's a false equivalency. How great a risk do far-right extremists pose, and are we doing enough about it in this country?
We are not doing enough about it. White supremacist violence has been a persistent problem in the United States since there has been a United States, and that problem did not go away. It's from the time that I worked these cases in the 90s through today, it's been a constant presence. What we have different is a president who's willing to give rhetorical sustenance to these groups, and I think that's extremely dangerous because it gives these groups the idea that what they're doing isn't criminal, but rather authorized by the government. And of course, the failure of law enforcement to address this violence as a priority is part of the problem.
What was your reaction at the debate last night when he was told to denounce white supremacist groups, and then he basically gave this call of action saying to stand down and stand by?
It's quite troubling because having spent time undercover in these groups, they're used to listening to dog whistles from government officials that they can interpret in a way that they take as positive. But this message was pretty loud and clear, and particularly the quick pivot to what the president likes to call the primary enemy of Antifa creates a problem because it is centralizing the focus of these groups' violence, basically saying the enemy of these fascist groups is the enemy of the president of the United States, and therefore the likelihood that violence will be undertaken, particularly when we're talking about something as ill-defined as Antifa, which is short for anti-fascism, and in fact can basically be applied to any perceived enemy the president or these far-right militant groups choose.
Yeah, some have called last night's statement a dog whistle into a bullhorn. But yesterday there was a hearing by the House Oversight Committee about white supremacists infiltrating law enforcement. Democratic Chairman Jamie Raskin said the bloody trail of violent white supremacy is now splattered across America, adding the virus of white supremacy is spreading. How much of an issue is this among local police? And while many communities debate police reform, what can be done to try and reverse course?
So it is a persistent problem. This is something that the FBI has warned about from the time that I was working undercover and in written products in 2006 and 2015. So it's a problem that's serious enough for the FBI to warn its own agents about the infiltration of white supremacists into law enforcement. I think it is a small part of the problem. There are other types of militant activist groups that law enforcement appears to have an affinity for, or some members of law enforcement do, and particularly what we see in the deprioritization of investigating white supremacist violence. And we can see
continue.
And we can see the difference in the way the police show up to a Black Lives Matter protest or to the Standing Rock Water Protectors protest, where they come in militarized gear and are very aggressively using tear gas and less lethal munitions versus the fairly light touch they bring to a white supremacist rally or a rally by one of these far-right militant groups that often devolve into actual violence against people, and yet you very rarely see aggressive follow-up to prosecute people for those crimes.
You can even see it in the language choice of calling some militia versus mobs. But that being said, what role do you think that social media plays in all of this? I mean, the president said that he sees most of the violence coming from the left. Just last night, Fox News' Chris Wallace incorrectly stated that most of the protests end up in riots when, in fact, 93% of the recent protests in this country have been peaceful. How does social media play a role in spreading division and hate, especially among extremists?
I'm concerned that the role of social media can be overplayed. Obviously, all of us use social media more than we did when I was undercover in the 1990s because we didn't have social media back then. But you have to understand that these groups these covert groups are often early adopters of new technology. And are sometimes more advanced even than law enforcement is. The first time I heard the term email was when I was undercover with neo-Nazi skinheads in the early 90s. So while it plays a role, I think it's just as important to understand how mainstream media plays a role in coloring the public perception of these protests and not really acknowledging what law enforcement knew in the 1990s, which this is an old tactic far-right militant groups use to go to areas where they know they have political opposition to engage in public rallies so that they can draw out their political opponents and attack them. And law enforcement back then was very good about making sure they were kept separate from anyone they might bring harm to, but that intelligence seems to have been lost in these recent protests, and that's quite troubling.
Michael German from the Brennan Center for Justice, we thank you so much for your insight and your time.
Thanks for having me.
And be sure to watch our special hour-long documentary, Homegrown Hate, The War Among Us, next Tuesday at 8 Eastern and Pacific, right here on ABC News Live.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.